The scent of an old bookstore is a unique perfume. It's a blend of aging paper, leather bindings, dried ink, and the faint, sweet aroma of brewing coffee from the small cafe I'd installed in the corner. For me, that scent was the smell of home, of purpose, of my entire life. Sterling Pages wasn't just a business, it was a sanctuary I had rebuilt in the heart of our small Pennsylvania town, a legacy I had inherited from my mother, Eleanor. My name is Catherine Sterling, though everyone calls me Kate. At 48, my life was woven into the very fabric of this store. 12 years ago, I had been a senior editor at a publishing house in New York City. I had a vibrant career, a sophisticated life, and a future that smelled of new book, smell, and literary award ceremonies. Then, my mother passed away from cancer, and the scent of my life changed. I came home to find Sterling Pages on life support, drowning in debt, its shelves half empty and its spirit broken. Now, seated around the familiar oak table in my father's house for our monthly family dinner, I felt a familiar tension coiling in the air. My father, Thomas, sat at the head of the table. He was a retired accountant, a man who understood numbers, but had never understood the unquantifiable value of a story. He'd always viewed the bookstore as a sentimental folly, a financial drain. Across from me sat my younger brother, David. 10 years my junior, David was the embodiment of modern ambition. He wore sharp suits, spoke in business, school buzzwords, and saw the world through the lens of scalability and profit margins. He had never worked a single day in the bookstore, yet he was full of opinions on how it should be run. The numbers for this quarter are solid, Kate, my father began, peering at a spreadsheet David had, of course, brought to dinner. But solid isn't spectacular, it's stagnant. It's a community bookstore, Dad, not a tech startup, I said, trying to keep my tone light. We're profitable, we employ 6 people, and we're a vital part of this town. We just hosted a literacy drive that provided over 500 books to local schools. David let out a soft, condescending chuckle. See, that's the problem. You're thinking in terms of charity. I'm thinking in terms of growth. The building itself is a prime piece of real estate on Main Street. The potential is being wasted on dusty books. It's not being wasted, I countered, my patience fraying. It's being used for its intended purpose. The purpose Mom envisioned. My father sighed, a long, weary sound he always used when he was about to deliver a verdict. Your mother was a wonderful woman, Kate, but she was a romantic, not a realist. We have to be realists now. That's why David and I have made an executive decision. We've been in negotiations for some time, and we've finally closed a deal. A cold dread washed over me. I looked from my father's determined face to David's smug expression. What kind of deal? David placed his hands on the table, leaning forward as if he were about to announce the invention of the wheel. We've sold the property, and the business name to the Daily Grind. The name hit me like a physical blow. The Daily Grind was a massive, ubiquitous coffee shop chain, known for buying up historic locations and gutting them to install their cookie-cutter cafes. You sold Sterling Pages to a coffee chain? I whispered, my voice hoarse with disbelief. You sold Mom's legacy so it could become another soulless franchise. It's not a sale, it's a partnership, David said brightly. A modernization? They're going to keep a small, curated book nook in the corner. It's the best of both worlds, and the best part is, as part of the deal, I will be the new franchise owner and manager of the Daily Grind on Main. I'll finally have the capital to show what real business management looks like. The betrayal was so absolute, so breathtakingly complete, that I couldn't even form a coherent thought. They had sold my life, my work, my mother's dream, and handed the keys to my brother, the man who thought books were dusty. And what about me? The question felt foolish as soon as it left my lips. The new corporation has no place for your traditionalist approach, my father said, refusing to meet my eyes. But the deal is very lucrative. We've made sure there's a generous check for you. A token of appreciation for your years of hard work. Enough for you to start something new. Perhaps a smaller, more manageable hobby. A hobby. 12 years of 70-hour weeks. Of pouring my own savings into keeping the lights on. Of crying in the back office over bills I couldn't pay. Of feeling the pure joy when a child discovered their first favorite book. All of it reduced to a hobby. Have you ever been so thoroughly erased by your own family? Have they ever taken your greatest passion and dismissed it as a trifle? If this story is already making your blood boil, please show your support by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. Your engagement helps us share these vital stories of resilience. And please, don't forget to hit the notification bell, because the final chapter of this story is one you won't want to miss. 12 years ago, I didn't just come home to manage a bookstore. I came home to wage a war. The store was weeks from foreclosure. My father wanted to sell it for a pittance to a developer. I used every cent of my savings from my New York career, over $150,000, as a down payment to buy out his immediate debt and take over operations. It wasn't a gift, it was a formal investment that gave me a 40% stake in the business, with him retaining 60%. It was a deal he begrudgingly accepted only because the alternative was a total loss. The work was grueling. I learned plumbing on YouTube to fix the leaky pipes in the basement. I learned accounting late at night to untangle the mess of my father's bookkeeping. I personally sanded and refinished the original hardwood floors, my hands raw and splintered. I cultivated relationships with authors, hosted late-night poetry slams, and started a children's story hour that became a town institution. Sterling Pages became profitable within 3 years. It became beloved within 5. It was my heart, made manifest in wood, paper, and ink. All the while, David was in Silicon Valley, failing spectacularly at a series of ill-conceived apps, always calling my father for a bridge loan to get him to his next brilliant, doomed idea. My father saw David's string of failures as taking shots, while he saw my steady, hard-won success as just keeping shop. Now, looking at them across the dinner table, I felt the ground fall away beneath me. They had used me. They let me pour my life, my money, my soul into rebuilding the house, and as soon as it was beautiful and strong, they sold it and gave the keys to the very person who had mocked my efforts. I stood up, my body moving with a strange, detached calm. I didn't shout, I didn't plead. The part of me that craved their approval had just been violently excised. I understand, I said, my voice eerily flat. I walked out of the dining room and out the front door, into the cool night air. I didn't know where I was going. I just walked. They thought they had written the final chapter. They thought my story was over. They had forgotten that my mother was the most brilliant character in this entire narrative. And my mother, a lover of secrets and stories, had left behind one final, unread chapter. A secret she had hidden away in plain sight, on a dusty shelf, waiting for a moment just like this. End of part 1. Type, continue. For part 2 of the unread chapter, the following week was a blur of calculated cruelty. David, my own brother, walked into the bookstore with a team of architects and designers from the Daily Grind. He acted as if he didn't know me, pointing to the hand-built shelves I had installed and saying to a woman in a sharp gray suit, "This will all have to go, of course. We'll need clean lines, more space for the espresso bar." They talked over me, around me, through me. The regular customers who came and saw the strangers with their measuring tapes and clipboards and looked at me with worried eyes. I could offer them no comfort. My father avoided me completely. When I went to the house to gather some of my mother's things, he would retreat to his study. The air was thick with his guilt and his stubborn refusal to admit he was wrong. They were a united front of betrayal. They had made their decision, and my feelings were just collateral damage. My pain was a physical thing, a heavy weight in my chest, but beneath the pain, a cold, hard anger was beginning to crystallize. I wasn't just going to let them erase my mother's legacy and my life's work. I refused to be a footnote in their story of corporate success. That resolve led me to the attic of the bookstore. It was a dusty, forgotten space, filled with my mother's old inventory, forgotten mementos, and boxes of her personal papers I hadn't had the heart to go through. I told myself I was looking for closure, for one last connection to her. But I think, subconsciously, I was looking for a weapon. For 2 days, I sorted through a lifetime of memories. I found her old diaries, filled with her thoughts on literature and her quiet frustrations with my father's lack of imagination. I found photographs of me as a little girl, sitting on her lap in the very same store, my eyes wide with wonder. The grief was overwhelming. On the 3rd day, I found it. It wasn't in a safe or a hidden compartment. It was tucked away inside a hollowed-out copy of Moby Dick, one of my mother's favorite novels. It was a thick, leather-bound journal, far heavier than it should have been. Inside, the pages were not filled with writing. They were a meticulously organized scrapbook of legal documents, correspondence, and notes. The title page, in my mother's beautiful calligraphy, read, "The Sterling Pages Community Trust." My heart started to pound. I sat down on a dusty trunk and began to read. My mother, Eleanor, had been a dreamer. But as my father had noted, she was also a realist. She had seen the direction the world was going, with small businesses being swallowed by corporations. And she had known the characters of the men in her life. Years before she died, when the store was still hers, she had done something extraordinary. Working with her own lawyer, she had legally separated the business, Sterling Pages, from the physical building that housed it. Then, she placed the building itself into an irrevocable community trust. The trust charter was a work of art. It stated that the building, located at 121's Main Street, was to be preserved as a historic landmark, and its primary use must be for an enterprise that actively fosters and promotes community literacy and the literary arts. The charter was specific. It outlined what this meant: hosting author events, providing public access to a diverse range of literature, running children's reading programs, and maintaining a space for quiet reading and community gathering. A franchise coffee shop with a book nook would be a laughable violation of every single clause. But here was the masterstroke. The trust named 2 trustees with the power to enforce its charter. The first was the acting mayor of our town. The second, upon my mother's death, was designated to be me, Catherine Sterling. And crucially, any change in the building's primary use required the unanimous, written consent of all trustees. My father and David had sold something they did not have the legal authority to sell. They owned the business, the name, the inventory, the debt. But they did not own the building. The building belonged to a trust, and I was its guardian. I sat there, in the dusty silence of the attic, holding the proof of my mother's incredible foresight. She had left me more than a legacy, she had left me a fortress. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a surge of adrenaline and righteous fury. I found the name of my mother's lawyer at the bottom of the trust documents. A Mr. Samuel Crow, from a respected firm in Philadelphia. I took a deep breath and made the call. Mr. Crow was old, but his mind was a steel trap. He remembered my mother and the trust perfectly. Eleanor was a remarkable woman, he said, after I explained the situation. She told me she was creating an insurance policy against her husband's pragmatism and her son's ambition. It seems her policy is about to pay out. The trust is ironclad, Catherine. They cannot sell that building to a coffee company without your signature. And from the sound of it, you have no intention of providing it. None whatsoever, I confirmed, my voice hard. What's our next move? Patience, the old lawyer advised. Let them proceed. Let them get to the very brink of their victory. Let the daily grind spend their money on architects and legal fees. The further they go, the more liable your father and brother will be for misrepresenting the asset. We don't make a move until they serve you with a formal eviction notice. At that point, we respond not to them, but directly to the CEO of the Daily Grind. We will show them they have purchased nothing but a lawsuit. The strategy was brilliant. It was ruthless. It was exactly what my mother would have done. For the next few weeks, I lived a double life. By day, I was the quiet, defeated woman packing up her life's work, nodding sadly to concerned customers. By night, I was on the phone with Samuel Crow, planning my counter-offensive. I documented every visit from David's corporate cronies, every condescending remark, every promise he made to them about the seamless transition. The official closing date arrived. David and my father went to a fancy dinner to celebrate. The next morning, a courier delivered a cold, formal envelope to the bookstore. It was an official notice to vacate the premises within 30 days, signed by a vice president at the Daily Grind. It was time. I scanned the letter and emailed it to Mr. Crow. His reply was swift. The trap is set. Now, we spring it. End of part 2. Type, continue, for part 3. Part 3, the unveiling the headquarters of the Daily Grind, was a monument to corporate sterility. It was a tower of glass and steel in Philadelphia, a place where the air smelled of recycled air and ambition. I had never felt more out of place, yet I had also never felt more powerful. I wore a simple, dark dress, a string of my mother's pearls my only armor. Beside me, Samuel Crow looked perfectly at home, his sharp suit and confident demeanor radiating an authority that money couldn't buy. We had requested an urgent meeting with the CEO, a man named Richard Pierce, under the pretense of discussing the terms of the transition. My father and David were also asked to be there. They walked into the boardroom looking confused, then openly alarmed when they saw me with a lawyer. "What is this, Kate?" my father demanded, his voice a low growl. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here to discuss my bookstore," I said calmly, taking a seat at the vast, polished table. Richard Pierce, a man with a tan that looked as expensive as his watch, entered the room, flanked by two of his own lawyers. He did not look pleased. "Let's make this quick," he said, sitting at the head of the table. "I have a tea time at 3. I assume this is about your severance." "Let me assure you, Miss Sterling, the terms are not negotiable." "Oh, I'm not here to discuss my severance," I said, giving him a small smile. "I'm here to discuss the fact that your multi-million-dollar acquisition of the property at 121 Main Street is null and void." A stunned silence fell over the room. David laughed, a short, nervous bark. "She's bluffing. She's just upset." Mr. Crow chose that moment to speak. He slid a beautifully bound copy of the Sterling Pages Community Trust documents across the table to Pierce's legal team. "I assure you, gentlemen, there is no bluff," he said, his voice mild but firm. "What you are looking at is the controlling legal document for the property in question. As you will see, the building was placed in an irrevocable trust nearly 20 years ago by the late Eleanor Sterling." He let them read for a moment, their faces shifting from skepticism to disbelief to outright horror. "Please direct your attention to Article IV, Section 2, Crow continued smoothly. "It stipulates the building's primary use must be to actively foster community literacy. A coffee shop, however successful, does not meet that legal standard. Furthermore, Article V, Section 1, requires the unanimous consent of all trustees for any change in use or transfer of property. As you can see, Miss Catherine Sterling is a trustee. She has not given her consent. Therefore, you have not purchased a building. You have purchased a very expensive piece of paper." Pierce's face had turned a dark shade of red. He glared at my father and brother. "What is this nonsense? Is this true?" My father was speechless, his face pale. David stammered. We owned the business. The property came with the business." "A common misconception," Crow said pleasantly, "but a legally fatal one. Your clients, Mr. Pierce, failed to perform their due diligence. They took your sellers at their word instead of performing a thorough title and trust search. A rather shocking oversight for a corporation of your size." One of Pierce's lawyers whispered furiously in his ear. He slammed his hand on the table. "This is fraud. You deliberately misrepresented the asset," he roared, pointing at my father and David. "You will be hearing from our legal department. We will sue you for every penny we have spent on this deal. Architects, lawyers, feasibility studies, plus punitive damages." "That sounds like a matter for the three of you to discuss," I said, standing up. "My work here is done. Thank you for your time, Mr. Pierce. I do hope you make your tea time." Mr. Crow and I walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind a scene of absolute chaos. The sound of Richard Pierce's enraged shouting followed us all the way to the elevator. The drive back to our small town was quiet. The weight of the last few weeks felt like it was lifting from my shoulders. My mother had done more than just save the bookstore. She had given me back my own strength. When I arrived back at Sterling Pages, my father and David were already there, waiting for me in the small back office. The fight had gone out of them. They looked broken. "They're going to ruin us, Kate," my father said, his voice barely a whisper. "The lawsuit, they're talking about millions. We'll have to sell the house, everything." "You did this to yourselves," I said, my voice not unkind but firm. "You let greed and arrogance blind you. You tried to sell a memory. You tried to sell my life." "What do you want from us?" David asked, his voice sullen. "You want to watch us lose everything." I looked at my brother, at the man-child who had caused so much pain, and then at my father, the man who had enabled it. I could have been vengeful. I could have let them face the consequences alone. But looking around the office, surrounded by the books and the memories of my mother, I knew that wasn't her way. Her solution was never about destruction. It was about preservation. "I don't want to watch you lose everything," I said. "I want to save this bookstore." Again, I laid out my terms. They were not negotiable. They would sign over their entire 60% stake in the business of Sterling Pages to me, for for the symbolic sum of $1. In exchange, I, in my capacity as trustee of the building, would agree not to pursue any legal action against them for their fraudulent attempt to sell the trust's property. The Daily Gren's lawsuit is your problem to solve, I told them. You will have to negotiate with them, probably by using the money from the sale of your own house. But I will not allow this bookstore or its assets to be touched. As of today, I am the sole owner of the business, and I am the controlling trustee of the building. My mother's legacy is secure. They stared at me, understanding dawning in their eyes. I had taken everything. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. I had cut them out of the business, just as they had tried to cut me out, but I had done it to save the bookstore, not to enrich myself. My father, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat, was the first to nod. All right, Kate, he said. All right. End of part 3. Type, continue. For part 4, the conclusion. For part 4 then the epilogue. The aftermath was messy, but it was a mess of their own making. As predicted, the Daily Gren's legal team was relentless. To avoid a protracted and embarrassing public lawsuit, my father was forced to sell the family home, the house I grew up in, and most of his other investments to reach a settlement. He went from being a wealthy, respected retiree to a man living in a small rented condo on the edge of town. David, stripped of his golden opportunity, and facing the consequences of his arrogance, couldn't handle the humiliation. He took what little money was left after the settlement and moved to Arizona, chasing another, next big thing. Our relationship was shattered beyond repair. With the ownership documents signed and filed, Sterling Pages was finally, completely mine. The business and the building, the body and the soul, were united under my sole guardianship. The first thing I did was close the store for 1 week. With the help of my loyal staff, and a few dedicated volunteers from the community, we gave it a loving refresh. We painted the walls, refinished the floors again, and installed better lighting. When we reopened, I held a small ceremony. I didn't mention the drama, the betrayal. I simply stood before a crowd of loyal customers and friends, and announced that the store was being officially renamed. It was now the Eleanor Sterling Book House. The story of how I had stood up to the corporate giant and my own family had become a local legend. People came from neighboring towns not just to buy books, but to support the idea of the place. Business boomed. I was able to hire more staff, expand the children's section, and start a small in-house press to publish local authors. The bookstore became more than a sanctuary, it became a beacon. About a year after the hostile takeover that never was, my father walked into the bookstore. It was the first time he had set foot in it since the renaming. He looked older, humbled. He didn't say anything at first, just walked through the aisles, running his hand over the spines of the books. He found me in the back office, going over invoices. Your mother would be proud. Catherine, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She was always the smart one. She knew. She always knew. It wasn't a full apology, but it was the closest I would ever get. It was an admission of his failure and a recognition of her wisdom and my strength. Yes, she was, I said quietly. He lived out the rest of his years in his small condo, a quiet man who had lost his fortune, but had perhaps, in the process, found a sliver of humility. We never regained the closeness of a father and daughter, but we reached a place of quiet, respectful peace. Sometimes, when the store is quiet in the late afternoon, and the sun streams through the large front windows, lighting up the dust motes dancing in the air, I feel my mother's presence. I feel her pride, her love, her fierce, protective spirit. She had armed me not just with a legal document, but with a legacy of resilience. I learned that a legacy isn't an inheritance to be sold, it's a story to be continued. And at that fateful family dinner, my father and brother had tried to write my final chapter. They didn't realize that they were merely the villains in the prologue of my real story. A story of a woman who, when her world was threatened, discovered that the greatest strength can be found hidden between the lines, in a mother's love, and in the quiet, unyielding power of her own voice. If this story of finding strength in the pages of your own life has moved you, please take a moment to hit the like button, share it with fellow book lovers and fighters, and subscribe to our channel. Every story of triumph over adversity deserves to be heard. What is the legacy you are fighting to protect? Have you ever found strength in an unexpected place? Please share your experiences in the comments below. Your story could be the one that gives someone else the courage to turn the page. And don't forget to ring that notification bell to join us for our next chapter. Thank you for listening.